Hello and welcome to WPI Talks. I'm Michael Genovese. I'm the president of the World Policy Institute at Loyola Marymount University. And welcome to this occasional discussion of public issues that affect us globally. I'm here today with Professor Larry Tritle of the History Department at Loyola Marymount University. Professor Tritle is a master teacher and an author of several very important and influential books, including Alexander the Great, A New History of the Peloponnesian War, and From Milos to My Lai. Professor Tritle has been very active in the movement towards veterans' rights. He served in Vietnam, and he's been at Loyola for over 30 years. Welcome, Professor Tritle.
Thank you, Professor Genovese. Happy to be here.
Our subject today is war and its consequences, and I wanted to start off by asking about a question of war and democracy. In the United States, less than 1%, 0.09%, of citizens serve in the military. 99% do not. And very few of our leaders have served in the military. Is this wise? Is it just? And is it sustainable?
No, I think this is one of the major issues confronting American democracy. And not only American democracy, but also the democracies of Europe, Western Europe, where this exact same issue applies, where you have a tiny percentage of the population engaged in military service, and the rest goes about their lives as if nothing was going on. Mm-hmm. And this does have a downside. We can see it in the case of the United States right now in terms of the current election and the number of former servicemen and women who are supporting Donald Trump. And part of the reason for this is there's a sense out there that among many of these individuals that they've paid the price, they've done all the heavy work, heavy labor, and they've been basically shoved aside by the rest of society. So yeah, I think it's a big problem, and there's an issue of justice involved here too.
You know, I remember at the end of the war in Vietnam, American veterans came back and were not well treated. And then after the war in Iraq, it was almost as if "thank you for your service" became a catchphrase without much meaning. How do you think we can better integrate former people from the armed forces into our society?
Well, you're certainly right that after Vietnam, the Vietnam generation was basically shunned, ignored, condemned for the actions of a few. After Iraq, after Afghanistan, the apparent welcoming was basically superficial, and there's probably no line today that annoys a former service member is for someone to say thank you for your service.
And yet that's kind of the rote.
Yeah, it's such a cheap, meaningless phrase, and it really drives a lot of people absolutely crazy. Because they sense the inherent injustice of the whole thing.
And so, apart from fixing the VA, what other things ought we to be doing for veterans?
Well, certainly fixing the VA and doing something to take care of service members who are in need of help, medical help, psychological help, and that sort of thing, would be major. It's kind of an uphill fight, given the nature of the budget and how you look at the VA budget. There's a lot of money there, but most of it goes into grounds and goes into salaries, and very little of it trickles down to the people who really need the help. This is a systemic issue within the structures of the U.S. government today. I suspect the same thing probably applies to the governments of Western Europe. Read the news media out of the UK, for example, you can see very similar issues there. This is a systemic issue.
And so this disconnect between citizen and citizen soldier, what does that do to the social fabric, to the social bonds that are supposed to hold a society together and sustain us through tough times?
Well, this is the other major issues in terms of this rather old-fashioned idea of civic virtue, civic responsibility, And the fact that in olden times, when military service was something that more people did, it actually pulled society together. You can haggle over some of the details and all this sort of thing, but after the First World War, certainly after the Second World War, a lot of the social changes that came about in the United States were the result of people realizing that the African American community, for example, was being called upon to serve. They did the job, and they didn't get much in return.
Mm-hmm.
And there were people who saw that, and in the course of the late 1940s and 1950s, changes began to happen. Were they across the board? Were they deep? No, probably not.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly not. But at the same time, things got to be done because there were simply more people serving.
You've written a lot about ancient Greece, ancient Rome, but your masterwork, in my view, is From Milos to Mailai, which is about the story of war and violence and society. I want you to talk a little bit about the impact that war has on a society.
Well, the impact that war has on society is very, very deep. It's ongoing. It doesn't end when the war's in, when the peace is signed. It ripples through society like a stone tossed into a still pond because of the impact on families. And yes, individuals return from the wars, but they are, in a sense, some are very damaged.
Mm-hmm.
Some are very damaged. Some individuals are very damaged, and this cannot but help touch their families. Mm-hmm. And this can be easily documented. And it's somewhat reassuring, perhaps, to see these kinds of issues in ancient Greece, mm-hmm. in ancient Rome, as well as today. So we know that war and violence is not a healthy thing, but yet we do it.
Okay. As a historian, we've talked about this before, and I want to give you a chance to talk about it again. Do we study history for the lessons it can provide us with today, or are there other reasons to study history?
No, this is an old saying. This idea that history teaches lessons, I don't believe it. Mm-hmm. The idea is I think the lack of truth in that can be seen in the fact that we keep doing some of the same things we've been doing for thousands of years. History is an art. History enables you to know who you are, where you've come from. It might give you some idea of where you might be going, but it certainly does not predict. And there are no lessons to be taken from it other than very commonsensical kinds of lessons that war is unhealthy for children and other living creatures.
Professor Tritle, thank you very much for being a part of this. We appreciate your time and your thoughts.
My pleasure.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.